In the autumn of 1806, a stunning proclamation from President Thomas Jefferson sent a shockwave across the young United States. It warned of a conspiracy, a secret expedition of armed men forming on the western rivers with a purpose unfriendly to the peace of the Union. It called for the immediate arrest of the plot's ringleader, a man whose name was known in every household from the drawing rooms of Philadelphia to the log cabins of the frontier, former Vice President Burr. The news was unthinkable. This was a man who had stood just one heartbeat from the presidency, a hero of the revolution, a founder of the nation. Now he was a fugitive, accused of the ultimate crime, treason. What had happened? What dark ambition could drive a man of such stature to raise a private army in the Appalachian wilderness? Was he a patriot preparing for a secret war against Spain, or a would-be emperor plotting to shatter the fragile American Republic and carve out his own kingdom in the West? Today, we will become detectives of the past, sifting through the forgotten clues of this grand and shadowy plot to finally answer the question, who was the real Burr? To understand the tragedy that unfolded, you first have to understand the world that was at risk. Not just the lives of a few men, but the very soul of a young nation. In 1805, the United States was less a single unified country and more a fragile alliance between the settled, powerful East and the wild, restless West. The Appalachian Mountains were the great dividing line, and the people who lived in their shadow felt like a nation unto themselves. They were veterans paid in land they had to fight for, Scots-Irish settlers who bowed to no authority but their own, and pioneers who saw the federal government not as a protector, but as a distant collection of politicians who neither understood nor cared about their struggles. Their lifeline, the mighty Mississippi River, was choked off at its mouth by the Spanish, who held New Orleans. To them, the Union felt like a promise broken. At the heart of this volatile frontier, there was a literal paradise, a place that symbolized everything that stood to be lost. On an island in the Ohio River, a wealthy Irish aristocrat named Harmon Blennerhassett had built a dream. Fleeing scandal in Europe, he and his brilliant wife, Margaret, had constructed a stunning white mansion, a beacon of European culture in the American wilderness. It was filled with telescopes, lavish libraries, and fine art. From its portico, one could hear music and scientific debate instead of the cry of the panther. Blennerhassett was a dreamer, a romantic, a man more at home with a chemistry experiment than a rifle. He sought a life of refined intellectual peace, far from the intrigues of the old world. His wife, Margaret, was his equal in every way, a poet, an accomplished horsewoman, and a gracious host who made their island a legendary oasis of hospitality. They had 2 young sons and a fortune they believed was secure. Their world was one of beauty, science, and domestic tranquility, an idyllic existence carved right out of the rugged frontier. They were not the only ones with a stake in the future. All along the river valleys, thousands of families had gambled everything on this new land. They had cleared the forests, fought off disease, and planted their hopes in the rich, dark soil. Their lives were hard, their dreams simple: to own their land, to provide for their children, and to have a say in their own destiny. They were a proud, tough, and deeply dissatisfied people, their hearts filled with a simmering resentment against the East and a burning hunger for the opportunities they believed lay just beyond the horizon. This, then, was the world that existed before the serpent entered the garden. A fragile nation, a perfect island paradise, and a populace of hardy frontiersmen, all vulnerable in their own ways. They were a collection of dreamers, idealists, and fighters, unknowingly waiting for a charismatic leader to ignite their passions and lead them toward a new destiny or toward their own destruction. The crime, in this case, was not discovered with a single gunshot or a body in a ravine. It was discovered in pieces, a slow dawning horror that spread through the Appalachian territories like a fever. The crime scene was the entire Ohio River Valley, and the clues were not stains of blood, but the sounds of hammers and the whispers of restless men. The epicenter of it all was Harmon Blennerhassett's idyllic island. The once peaceful estate had been transformed. The music and philosophical debates were replaced by the ring of blacksmiths' anvils and the thud of axes. Locals paddling past the island in their skiffs saw things that made no sense. A fleet of 15 massive keelboats was being constructed, far more than any group of simple settlers would need. Harmon Blennerhassett, the gentle scholar, had turned the grand halls of his mansion into a workshop, using his fireplaces to kiln dry the wood for the boats. Huge quantities of supplies were being stockpiled: barrels of pork, sacks of flour, and casks of whiskey, enough to sustain an army, not a handful of families heading to a new farm. The most unsettling clues were the men themselves. Young, rootless, and ambitious men from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky began to gather on the island. They weren't farmers. They carried new rifles and spoke not of planting seasons, but of adventure and glory. When questioned, they were evasive, offering a sly grin and a vague promise of riches to be won in the South. The story changed depending on who was telling it. Some said they were off to settle the Bastrop Tract, a massive land grant in Texas. Others winked and spoke of a secret government mission to fight the Spanish. The scene spoke of a grand conspiracy unfolding in plain sight, yet its true purpose remained maddeningly obscure. Was this an elaborate land speculation, as Burr publicly claimed? Or was it the secret mobilization of a patriot army waiting for the president's signal to march on Spanish territory? Or was it something far darker, the birth of a rebel force preparing to turn its guns on its own country? The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions that grew louder with every plank nailed into place. At the center of this storm of rumor and preparation stood one man, the obvious and immediate suspect: Aaron Burr. This was not some backwoods rabble-rouser. This was a political giant, a fallen angel of the Republic. By 1805, Burr was a political ghost, a man whose career had been immolated in the fires of scandal. As vice president, he had been sidelined and distrusted by Thomas Jefferson. Then came the final, fatal blow, his duel with Alexander Hamilton. By killing his great rival, Burr had made himself a pariah in the East, a man reviled in the very halls of power he had once commanded. His motive, whispered from the taverns of Pittsburgh to the halls of Congress, was not simple greed, but something far more potent: a burning desire for revenge. This entire Western enterprise was seen as a grand and audacious act of personal vengeance against the nation and the man who had cast him out. Burr felt betrayed by the American political system, and his ambition was to build a new empire in the West, so powerful and glorious that it would dwarf the United States. He would show Jefferson, he would show all of them, what a mistake they had made. To the people in the East, his actions weren't about settling land. They were about settling a score. The initial evidence was Burr himself, and the godlike manner in which he traveled through the wilderness. He journeyed down the Ohio not in a humble canoe, but on a magnificent 60-foot barge, a floating mansion complete with a dining hall and wine cellar. Imagine the spectacle, this vessel of Eastern luxury gliding past the rough log cabins of the frontier. It was a statement of power and intent, the procession of a king, not the humble transport of a pioneer. Whispers followed him everywhere, born of his almost hypnotic personal charm. Witnesses described a man with piercing dark eyes who could hold a room captive with his words. He didn't just ask for support. He seduced men into his vision. He made every farmer, every militia captain, every wealthy planter feel as though they were the single most important person to the success of his grand and secret enterprise. The sheer number of influential men who flocked to his banner was damning evidence in itself. From the moment his grand barge appeared on the river, there was no doubt who the leader was. Every rifle purchased, every boat built, every secret oath sworn in the dead of night pointed directly back to one man, the disgraced Vice President, Aaron Burr. But as grand as Burr's ambition was, He wasn't acting alone. He couldn't be. To seize New Orleans and control the West, he needed more than a few dozen frontiersmen in keelboats. He needed a military man on the inside, a powerful ally who could deliver the U.S. Army itself into his hands. He had such a partner, a man whose position made the entire scheme seem not just possible, but destined for success. General James Wilkinson, the commanding general of the entire United States Army and the governor of the Louisiana Territory. He was Burr's most trusted confidant, his co-conspirator, the sword that would carve out their new empire. And here, my friends, is where the story twists from a simple tale of ambition into a shadowy labyrinth of deceit. For what no one in Burr's inner circle knew, what the frontiersmen flocking to his banner could never have imagined, was that General Wilkinson, the highest-ranking soldier in the United States, was living a lie. For years, he had been a secret agent on the payroll of the Spanish government, known to his handlers only as Agent 13. Wilkinson's loyalty was not to Aaron Burr, nor was it to President Jefferson. His true master was himself, and his motive was a toxic cocktail of greed and a desperate instinct for self-preservation. He was playing the most dangerous game imaginable, promising support to Burr's conspiracy while feeding information to his Spanish masters, all while maintaining his position as America's top general. With this horrifying truth in mind, all of Wilkinson's actions snap into a darker focus. His letters to Burr, filled with encouragement and bold promises of delivering New Orleans, were not the communications of a loyal partner. They were the calculated words of a master manipulator, luring Burr deeper and deeper into the trap. He fanned the flames of Burr's ambition, assuring him that the army was ready, that the Creole population of New Orleans would welcome him as a liberator. Each promise was another thread in the web he was weaving around his supposed friend. His apparent support was pure theater, a performance for an audience of one. Re-examined, every action reeks of a darker truth. Wilkinson was not helping Burr build an empire. He was helping him build a gallows. He waited, letting Burr invest his money, his reputation, and the lives of his followers. He let the conspiracy grow just large enough to be a credible threat, all the while holding an axe over its neck, positioning himself to be the hero who would eventually save the very nation he was helping to endanger. The greatest threat to Aaron Burr wasn't the president in Washington, but the trusted brother-in-arms standing right beside him. But the conspiracy wasn't just a drama between American titans. The Appalachian frontier was not some isolated stage. It was the explosive friction point between competing empires, a grand chessboard where the players were not just ambitious individuals, but entire nations. Beyond the personal vendettas and internal betrayals, there was a third looming force at play, the shadowy hand of foreign powers, particularly Great Britain and Spain. They were the external threat, the silent partners whose interests stood to be served by chaos on the American frontier. Their motives were as cold and impersonal as they were powerful. Great Britain, still stinging from its defeat in the Revolution, saw in Burr's plan a golden opportunity to fracture and weaken its upstart rival. A new, independent Western Republic, hostile to the United States and friendly to the Crown, would be a strategic masterstroke. It would halt American expansion and give Britain effective control over the Mississippi River and the heart of the continent. The British minister in Washington, Anthony Merry, listened with great interest to Burr's proposals, seeing a chance to undo the results of the war. Spain, on the other hand, was a crumbling empire motivated by pure fear. They looked at the aggressive, land-hungry American frontiersmen pouring over the Appalachians and saw an existential threat to their most valuable colonial possession, silver-rich Mexico. For the Spanish, Burr's plot was both a terrifying danger and a potential solution. A successful invasion would be a catastrophe, but a civil war that turned Americans against each other could keep them occupied for decades, protecting the Spanish border through mutual destruction. This foreign meddling created a poisonous paranoia that seeped into every settlement along the river. Who could be trusted? Locals spoke of well-dressed strangers with European accents appearing in frontier taverns, men with heavy coin purses and too many questions. Rumors spread that the incredible sums of money funding Burr's expedition were not coming from his own ruined fortune, but from the coffers of a foreign king. This wasn't just a domestic rebellion anymore. It was an international intrigue, and the hardy folk of Appalachia were being courted, manipulated, and used as pawns in a game whose rules they didn't understand, by forces whose ultimate loyalty was to a distant throne. The initial pursuit of Burr was not a chase through the mountains, but a maddening hunt through a wilderness of lies. Burr, a master of political intrigue, had constructed a labyrinth of false trails and red herrings so brilliant that it paralyzed his enemies and confused his friends. The investigation, led from a distance by a deeply worried President Jefferson, repeatedly crashed against the wall of Burr's plausible deniability. The most powerful of these false trails was the public and seemingly legitimate one, the settlement of the Bastrop Tract. Burr had purchased a massive disputed land claim on the Ouachita River in what is now Louisiana. To the world, he was simply the leader of a land company, gathering brave pioneers to build a new life in the West. It was the perfect cover. Every boat built, every barrel of flour purchased, every man recruited could be explained away as a necessary preparation for this grand, legal settlement. When local officials came snooping, they were shown land deeds and contracts. Burr would greet them with the disarming charm of a respectable businessman, asking, "Gentlemen, is it now a crime in this republic to seek one's fortune?" The lead would go cold. For those who weren't satisfied by the simple story of a land venture, Burr had a more intoxicating bait: the patriot's cloak. He would take a man like Andrew Jackson aside and, in a low, confidential tone, hint that this entire expedition was a secret plan, tacitly approved by the administration in Washington. War with Spain was imminent, he'd suggest, and his force of hardy frontiersmen was meant to be the vanguard of the American army, ready to seize Texas or even Mexico the moment hostilities began. This masterstroke of misdirection turned potential accusers into enthusiastic allies. How could you arrest a man who was carrying out the president's secret orders? Back in Washington, Thomas Jefferson was wrestling with shadows. The reports that reached him were a maddening torrent of contradictions. One letter would paint Burr as a traitorous madman, the next as a misunderstood patriot. The vastness of the Appalachian frontier swallowed the truth. Messengers took weeks to travel, and by the time Jefferson could act on a piece of intelligence, the situation on the ground had already changed. He dispatched agents to the Ohio, but they too became lost in the fog of rumor. The investigation was dying a death of 1,000 dead ends. The posse would gather, ready to act on a damning rumor, only to find Burr had already sailed downriver, leaving behind a camp of men who swore they were just simple farmers. Promising leads evaporated in the Appalachian mist. This growing frustration in Washington and the rising confusion on the frontier was exactly what Burr intended. His campaign of misdirection was his greatest weapon, allowing his conspiracy to grow in plain sight, shielded by a brilliant wilderness of lies. President Jefferson's agents quickly discovered they were not just fighting against Burr, they were fighting against the entire culture of the Appalachian frontier. When they arrived in the bustling river towns and isolated homesteads to ask questions, they were met with a wall of silence, as thick and impenetrable as the mountain laurel. Doors were politely shut in their faces. Men in taverns would suddenly fall quiet, turning to stare into their mugs of ale. Neighbors who saw everything suddenly saw nothing. Those who heard the feverish preparations heard only the wind in the trees. You see, this was not the silence of simple ignorance. It was a deliberate collective act of defiance born from a deep and abiding distrust of the federal government. To these people, the men from Washington were the outsiders, the tax collectors, the agents of Eastern bankers who held their land titles. Burr, by contrast, was one of them. He was a war hero, a man of action, an enemy of the very Eastern elite they despised. Asking a Kentucky farmer to betray Aaron Burr to a federal agent was like asking him to side with the fox against his own hounds. It went against the grain of his very soul. This silence was also rooted in a shared dream. Burr wasn't just selling a conspiracy, he was selling hope. His vision of a Western empire, of conquering the riches of Mexico, became their vision. Their sons and brothers were the young men signing up for the expedition. Their crops were feeding the recruits, their whiskey filling the barrels on the boats. The entire region was complicit, bound together by a web of kinship, commerce, and a mutual gamble on a glorious future. To speak against Burr was to speak against their own community, against their own aspirations, and against the prospect of a better life that felt, for the first time, within their grasp. The psychological toll on anyone who considered breaking the code was immense. A man who voiced his doubts about Burr at the local store might find himself ostracized, his credit suddenly no good. A ferryman who reported the movement of armed men might find his boat mysteriously cut adrift in the night. There was no need for overt threats. The fear of retribution was a cold, unspoken understanding. In a land where a man's survival depended on his neighbors, isolation was a death sentence. And so, the people saw nothing, heard nothing, and said nothing, creating a perfect, silent incubator where treason could grow in the open air. For months, the conspiracy had been protected by Burr's masterful deceptions and the frontier's code of silence. But the turning point, the clue that finally broke the case wide open, did not come from a dusty attic or a deathbed confession. It came in a sealed dispatch, carried by military courier across hundreds of miles of wilderness, penned by the hand of the conspiracy's most important architect. The clue was a letter, and the man who wrote it was General James Wilkinson. Stationed in Louisiana, far from the prying eyes of the East, Wilkinson played his double game as long as he could. But by the late autumn of 1806, he realized the plot was faltering. The expected money from Britain hadn't arrived, recruitment was slower than hoped, and President Jefferson was growing more suspicious by the day. Wilkinson saw that the ship was sinking, and he decided his best move was not just to jump, but to set the entire vessel on fire and claim the reward for sounding the alarm. He chose a side, and it was his own. The letter that arrived on President Jefferson's desk was a masterpiece of calculated treachery. To save himself, Wilkinson had to portray Burr as the greatest villain the Republic had ever known, and himself as the loyal soldier who had uncovered the plot. He laid out the conspiracy in the most terrifying terms imaginable. He spoke of a plan to seize New Orleans, rob the banks, incite a civil war, and create a Western empire with Burr on the throne. He painted Burr not as a mere adventurer, but as an American Napoleon, a devil whose ambition threatened the very existence of the United States. This letter was the forgotten clue that had been hiding in plain sight all along, the word of a traitor. For Jefferson, it was the moment of horrifying clarity. The fog of rumor was instantly burned away. The contradictory reports, the whispers, the vague warnings, they were all replaced by this one damning account from the highest-ranking general in the army. The labyrinth of lies that Burr had so carefully constructed collapsed in an instant. The letter changed everything. There was no more room for doubt, no more need for cautious investigation. The threat was real, it was imminent, and its full, treasonous scope was finally laid bare. A renewed and terrible urgency seized the capital. The time for waiting was over. The time for action was now. The moment Jefferson broke the seal on that letter, the game was over, and the manhunt was about to begin. With Wilkinson's damning letter in hand, President Thomas Jefferson acted. He issued a presidential proclamation that swept down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers like a flood, a single sheet of paper that tore away the web of lies and unmasked Aaron Burr before the entire nation. The proclamation ordered all civil and military officers to seize the illegal expedition, its boats, its supplies, and its leader. There was no more ambiguity, no more talk of secret government plans or peaceful settlement. The President of the United States had officially branded Aaron Burr a traitor. The news shattered the conspiracy. For the young men gathered on Blennerhassett Island and in camps along the river, the unmasking was a moment of brutal awakening. The dream of Mexican silver and grand adventure evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark reality of treason. They weren't patriots in waiting. They were outlaws, fugitives in their own country. The cause they had pledged their lives to was revealed as a criminal enterprise. And what was the true plot? The one hidden beneath all the layers of deceit. The forgotten clues, the letters between the conspirators, and Wilkinson's own self-serving confession finally revealed the chilling truth. Burr's plan was a masterpiece of flexible ambition. The first step was to lead his army of frontiersmen to New Orleans. He would seize the city, its federal arsenal, and its treasury. From there, his options would open up. If the moment was right, he would persuade the western states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, to secede from the Union and form a new Western empire with himself as its head. If secession proved difficult, he would use the captured funds and weapons to launch his own private invasion of Spanish Mexico, conquering its silver mines and crowning himself Emperor Aaron I. His motive was a volcanic mixture of personal revenge and grandiose destiny. Scorned by the nation he had helped to build, he sought to create a new one in his own image, a vigorous, martial empire free from the constraints of Jeffersonian democracy. He saw himself not as a traitor, but as a new Napoleon, a man of action destined to forge a continent. But as Burr was unmasked as a traitor to his country, a second, more profound unmasking was taking place in the shadows of history. The man who brought him down, General James Wilkinson, was revealed to be a traitor of a different order. He was a man who betrayed everyone. He betrayed Spain by plotting with Burr. He betrayed Burr by exposing him to Jefferson. And he betrayed the United States by serving as a paid foreign agent while commanding its armies. The Great Burr conspiracy was not ultimately foiled by loyal patriots. It was cannibalized from within, brought down by the successful treachery of its second-in-command, a man whose only motive was his own survival and profit. This was the final, ugly truth. The plot to create a new empire was destroyed by an even deeper, more personal betrayal. The president's words fell upon the frontier not like rain, but like shards of ice. The proclamation, spreading from rider to rider, shattered the grand conspiracy in 1,000 pieces. On Blennerhassett Island, the heart of the enterprise, the dream died in a single night of chaos. The Virginia militia descended not upon a disciplined military camp, but upon a confused and terrified group of men who now understood they had been betrayed. With Burr and Blennerhassett already downriver, the abandoned recruits, their hopes of glory and riches turned to ash, unleashed their fury on the paradise that had lured them in. Through the eyes of Margaret Blennerhassett, who had been left behind, paradise was lost in a symphony of destruction. She didn't see a battle, she heard the end of a world. She heard the splintering crash of fine cherrywood as elegant furniture was broken apart. The air filled with the sharp, sickening sound of shattering Venetian glass and the reek of whiskey spilled on priceless Persian rugs. She heard the drunken shouts of men she had once fed at her own table, their voices no longer filled with hope, but with a bitter, aimless rage. In the main hall, dark, ragged holes began to appear in the fine linen draperies, the silent witnesses of a dream being shot to pieces. Forced to flee with her children into the freezing December night, her only transport was an open riverboat. As it was pushed out into the icy current, she looked back at her magnificent home, its windows blazing with light, not from a joyous party, but from the fires set within by the rampaging men. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing silence as her home, her dream, and her future were consumed by the darkness. Miles downriver, Aaron Burr himself heard the news of Wilkinson's betrayal and Jefferson's proclamation. The unmasking was absolute. In an instant, his grand design crumbled. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne was now forced into the disguise of a common boatman, hoping to slip through the net that was closing around him. He became a fugitive, his flight a desperate scramble toward the Spanish territory in Florida. The end came not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield, but in a muddy swamp in the backwoods of what is now Alabama. He was not cornered in a heroic last stand. He was simply recognized by his aristocratic bearing and his fine, elegant boots, mired in the filth. The would-be emperor was captured without a single shot being fired. The Grand Western Army was no more. The boats were impounded, the men scattered to the winds, and the beautiful mansion on the island stood silent and ravaged, a monument to a spectacular failure. The conspiracy was over, ending not with a bang, but with the hollow echo of a dream breaking. Aaron Burr was brought to Richmond, Virginia, to stand trial for treason, and what followed was not merely a legal proceeding, but a political war waged in a courtroom. It was a spectacle that gripped the entire nation. In one corner stood President Thomas Jefferson, consumed with a burning, almost personal need to see his old rival hanged. In the other corner sat the judge, the formidable Chief Justice John Marshall, a man who was not only Jefferson's political enemy, but also his cousin. And at the center of it all was Aaron Burr, who, far from being a broken-down prisoner, acted as his own lead counsel, his brilliant legal mind as sharp and dangerous as ever. The atmosphere in Richmond was electric. The city swelled with crowds, a chaotic mix of statesmen, lawyers, frontiersmen who had come to testify, and curious onlookers eager for a glimpse of the great traitor. The prosecution, backed by the full power of the presidency, presented a mountain of evidence detailing Burr's grand ambitions and military preparations. Jefferson himself from Washington attempted to micromanage the case, convinced that the very survival of the Republic depended on a guilty verdict. But Chief Justice Marshall saw the trial through a different lens. He saw the danger not just from Burr's ambition, but from a president willing to bend the law to destroy a political foe. Marshall stood firm on a strict, narrow definition of treason as laid out in the Constitution itself. He instructed the jury that to be guilty of treason, a person must commit an overt act of war against the United States. Simply plotting to do so, gathering men, or speaking of empire was not enough. The prosecution had to prove that Burr's army had actually levied war, which of course it never had. There had been no battle, no shots fired at American troops. The president's fury was immense, but the Chief Justice would not yield. Trapped by this strict constitutional standard, the prosecution's case collapsed. They could prove intent, they could prove conspiracy, but they could not prove an overt act of war. After all the drama, all the testimony, and all the political maneuvering, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. Aaron Burr, the man who dreamed of empire and set the entire West ablaze, walked out of the courtroom a free man. The verdict was a stunning legal victory, but a profound moral failure in the eyes of many. Jefferson was enraged, the public was bewildered, and the frontiersmen who had followed Burr were left ruined and betrayed. While legally innocent of treason, Burr was found guilty in the court of public opinion. He was a free man, but his name was forever destroyed, his honor gone. The verdict, a landmark in American law, remains controversial to this day. A verdict that still sparks arguments in these hills about whether justice was truly served, or if the greatest traitor of them all simply got away with it. The storm of the Burr conspiracy had passed, but the wreckage was strewn across a generation. Though acquitted, Aaron Burr was a ruined man. He became a living ghost, a specter of his former self, ostracized from the country he had once helped to lead. He spent years in self-imposed exile in Europe, still scheming, still trying to find a foreign monarch to back his imperial dreams, but he was a man without a country and without credibility. He eventually returned to America and spent his final decades as an obscure lawyer in New York City, haunted by the shadows of what might have been. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne died in relative poverty, his name forever synonymous not with founder, but with traitor. For Harmon and Margaret Blennerhassett, the dream had become a permanent nightmare. Their island paradise was a memory, their mansion a looted shell, their fortune gone. Harmon was arrested and spent months in a Richmond prison before the charges were dropped in the wake of Burr's acquittal. But his freedom was a hollow victory. Hounded by debt and disgrace, the couple wandered for years, from Mississippi to Canada to the Caribbean, trying to rebuild their lives, but they never recovered. Harmon died in poverty, and Margaret's final years were spent petitioning a Congress that had long forgotten her for some compensation for their ruined home. The idyllic life they had built in the wilderness was the first and most tragic casualty of Burr's ambition. But not everyone was destroyed. In Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, the fiery general who had been so taken with Burr, emerged from the scandal not only unscathed, but strengthened. He had been cautious, demanding proof that Burr's plans were sanctioned by the government. When that proof never came, and Wilkinson's betrayal was revealed, Jackson swiftly and publicly distanced himself from the plot, positioning himself as a loyal patriot who had been misled. The affair taught him a valuable lesson in political survival and reinforced his reputation as a shrewd and decisive leader. His brush with Burr's treason did nothing to slow his own meteoric rise to power. And the arch-traitor himself, General James Wilkinson, the man who had betrayed Spain, Burr, and the United States, he was never held to account. Despite a congressional investigation that uncovered his long history as a Spanish spy, he was exonerated, his web of lies and influence proving too thick to penetrate. He retained his command, continued his career, and died years later, the ultimate survivor of the web of lies he himself had spun. His fate was perhaps the story's bitterest lesson, that in the murky world of power, the greatest crimes are sometimes the ones that go unpunished. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, the traces of this grand and failed dream have not vanished from the land. The conspiracy is not just a story in a history book, it is a scar left on the map of Appalachia, a memory etched into the landscape itself. If you travel today to a small island in the Ohio River near Parkersburg, West Virginia, you can step right into the heart of the story. Blennerhassett Island is now a state park. The magnificent Palladian mansion, destroyed by fire and the passage of time, has been meticulously reconstructed, its white columns rising once more from the wilderness. You can walk through its halls and stand on its portico, looking out at the same river that once carried Burr's ambitions, and it is almost impossible not to feel the ghosts of that hopeful, tragic autumn. But the island is not the only place the memory lives on. It lingers in the old stories, in the local folklore of the river valley. For generations after Burr fled, treasure hunters would search the caves and hollows along the Ohio. They were looking for Burr's lost treasure, chests of Spanish silver and gold that legend says he was forced to bury when he became a fugitive. No great treasure was ever found, of course, but the myth itself is a powerful echo of the original promise that lured men to his banner. The dream of unimaginable wealth, a shortcut to a better life, buried just beneath the Appalachian soil. The land itself has not forgotten. The Ohio River, the great artery of the conspiracy, still flows past the same towns, Marietta, Parkersburg, Cincinnati, that once buzzed with whispers of the coming expedition. Standing on its banks today, watching the slow-moving barges, it is easy to imagine the sight of Burr's keelboats filled with armed men slipping past in the pre-dawn mist on their way toward a destiny they could not yet see. The river remembers. It was the silent witness to the entire affair, from the first nail hammered into a boat to the final desperate flight of its leader. And so, the story endures, passed down not in textbooks, but in the heart of the region itself. It has become a part of the Appalachian identity, a cautionary tale about a man of great ambition who tried to harness the restless spirit of the frontier for his own glory. The world might forget the details of the Burr conspiracy, but the mountains, the rivers, and the people who live in their shadow hold on to these memories. They remember the charismatic devil who came down the river, the paradise that was lost, and the grand dream of a Western empire that almost tore the nation apart before it was ever truly whole. And so, we come back to the question that started our journey into the shadows of the past. Was Aaron Burr a misunderstood patriot, or was he a would-be emperor? The truth, as is so often the case in these mountains, is far more complicated. Burr was a mirror. To men like Andrew Jackson, he reflected their own patriotic desire to fight the Spanish. To the dreamer Harmon Blennerhassett, he reflected a vision of an enlightened new society. And to the restless young men of the frontier, he reflected their own hunger for glory and wealth. The terrible genius of Aaron Burr was his ability to be all of these things at once, a man whose true plan was so cloaked in ambiguity that it allowed everyone to see in it the fulfillment of their own deepest desires. But this is a story not just of one man's ambition. It is a timeless lesson on the fragility of a nation. The Burr conspiracy laid bare the deep and dangerous cracks in the foundation of the young American Republic. It showed how easily the souls of a proud and forgotten people can be stirred by a charismatic leader who speaks to their grievances. The resentments of the Appalachian settlers were real, their feeling of abandonment was justified, and their discontent created a powder keg that Burr, for a moment, held the match to. This story serves as a stark and chilling warning that a union is not held together by laws and documents alone, but by a shared sense of purpose and trust. When that trust is broken, when a part of the nation feels its voice is not heard, the door is opened for men like Aaron Burr. It is a tale of how personal vendetta can masquerade as political destiny, and how the dream of a more perfect union can so nearly be shattered by the dream of a private empire. And now, my friends, you know the story of the phantom empire that rose and fell on these western waters, or at least as much of it as the river is willing to give up.